Now, the military-led West African nations of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have announced their withdrawal from the International Criminal Court, branding it a neo-colonial imperialist tool.
Africa was supposed to sit quietly while Europe's judges in black robes decided who among us was a criminal and who was not. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger just shattered that illusion. In one announcement, they torched the International Criminal Court's credibility and exposed what it always was: a colonial courtroom dressed up as justice. For 2 decades, the ICC has pretended to be universal, yet it has only ever had one hunting ground: Africa. Bush was untouchable. Blair untouchable. Macron is untouchable. But African leaders, they were trophies for The Hague. Now the Sahel has said enough. This is not a withdrawal, it's a rebellion. It's the first time in years that African states have told the West, your laws are not our chains, your court is not our master, and your approval is no longer required. But what will this mean for Africa? Let's find out. The world woke up to headlines it didn't expect, though perhaps it should have. In the early hours of September 23, 2025, the military-led governments of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger released a joint statement that cut through diplomatic niceties like a knife. They are withdrawing with immediate effect from the International Criminal Court. The message was delivered with military precision, stern, unbending, without the usual qualifiers that accompany such announcements. There was no talk of review, no committees, no wait and see. It was a clean break. The court that once claimed to be the arbiter of international justice was declared, in its words, a tool of neo-colonial repression. In one coordinated move, the 3 governments placed themselves outside the reach of an institution that had, for years, hovered like a threat over their leadership, their soldiers, and even their sovereignty. The symbolic weight of this decision cannot be overstated. This is not some obscure technical withdrawal from a trade body. This is 3 African states in unison, telling Europe and the wider West, your courtroom is not our destiny. What makes this announcement even more explosive is its timing. These countries are not stable democracies celebrating peace treaties. They are nations in the grip of insurgency, war, and transition. Each one is run by a military junta that seized power in coups between 2020 and 2023. Each one is locked in brutal fights against militants who have turned the Sahel into the world's deadliest conflict zone. And yet, instead of bowing to international scrutiny in exchange for legitimacy, they are rejecting it wholesale. The sheer audacity of it has rattled diplomatic circles from Brussels to Washington. Reactions have been swift. That is why the West is nervous. This isn't just a legal withdrawal. It's a crack in the facade of international institutions that still claim universality while operating through selective enforcement. If 3 nations can walk out today, what stops 5 more tomorrow? What happens if the African Union, already skeptical of the ICC, throws its weight behind an exodus? Suddenly, the ICC's African legitimacy, already fragile, could collapse entirely. The breaking news is not simply that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are leaving. The breaking news is that they've turned the ICC itself into the accused. They've put the court on trial in the court of global public opinion, exposing its hypocrisy to ordinary Africans who already suspected it. And that accusation cannot be ignored no matter how many press releases flow from The Hague. But this raises the next question. Why does this accusation sting so much? Why does it resonate not just in the Sahel but across the continent? To answer that, we have to step back and look at the ICC's long history in Africa, a history that explains why the Sahel's withdrawal feels less like an anomaly and more like the inevitable breaking point. If the Sahel's withdrawal feels like the bursting of a dam, it's because the water has been rising for decades. The International Criminal Court did not lose Africa overnight. It eroded its own credibility brick by brick, case by case, until this rupture became inevitable. To understand the bitterness of today, you have to revisit the court's history on the continent, because every indictment, every selective prosecution, every silent omission was a cut that eventually bled into rebellion. When the ICC was created in 2002, many African countries were among its earliest signatories. There was hope, genuine hope, that the court would finally end the era of impunity that plagued dictators and warlords. leaders in Kampala, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa signed on with the belief that justice would no longer be a privilege of the powerful, but a universal standard. But that illusion shattered quickly. The very first full investigations launched by the ICC were in Africa. Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Central African Republic became the proving grounds of The Hague. Soon after, Sudan's Omar al-Bashir became the first sitting head of state indicted by the court. Then came Kenya, Ivory Coast, Libya. The list grew, and the map of ICC action looked increasingly like a map of Africa itself. Of the first 30 people indicted by the ICC, nearly all were African. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was structural. Powerful Western nations like the United States, Russia, and China never ratified the Rome Statute. They kept themselves outside the court's jurisdiction while encouraging African states to sign. The result was a tilted playing field. African leaders had opened their doors, and the ICC walked straight in, while Washington, Moscow, and Beijing kept theirs shut. That imbalance meant that while George W. Bush could order the invasion of Iraq without consequence, Sudanese generals could find themselves facing international warrants. The African Union noticed. By the early 2000s, frustration with the ICC was boiling. At summits, leaders accused the court of hunting Africans. They pointed out the glaring double standards. Tony Blair was never summoned for the disaster of Libya, Nicolas Sarkozy never faced charges for his role in regime change, and not a single Western general was prosecuted for civilian deaths in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, African presidents were spending years in legal limbo, their reputations shredded by cases that sometimes collapsed without convictions. But what really deepened the resentment was not just who was prosecuted, but who wasn't. Colonial crimes were never touched. France's brutal role in Rwanda, Belgium's atrocities in Congo, Britain's abuses in Kenya. None of these crimes ever appeared on The Hague's docket. By excluding historical injustices, the ICC seemed to Africans less like a tool of justice and more like a weapon of amnesia, erasing Europe's sins while magnifying Africa's. Over time, this perception hardened into political reality. In 2016, Burundi became the first country to formally withdraw from the ICC, citing bias. South Africa briefly announced its own exit before pulling back. Kenya openly defied the court when its leaders were indicted. The writing was on the wall. The ICC's credibility in Africa was hanging by a thread. That thread snapped when the Sahel states decided they had nothing left to lose. The ICC's selective prosecutions had already alienated them. The silence on Western interventions in Libya had already enraged them. And now, as insurgencies ravaged their lands, the threat of investigations against their own armies was the final insult. The court had lost the moral authority it once claimed. So when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger walked out, they were not breaking tradition, they were fulfilling it. They were carrying to its logical conclusion a decade-long African critique of an institution that never delivered what it promised. But this still leaves a pressing question. If the ICC failed so consistently in Africa, what fills the vacuum it leaves behind? Justice cannot simply vanish. Someone has to address war crimes, atrocities, and the wounds of conflict. And that leads us to the heart of the matter. In the middle of the Sahel's wars, what does sovereignty really mean? And why did these states risk everything to take justice into their own hands? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. To understand why Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger tore up their membership in the ICC, you have to leave The Hague's marble halls and walk into the dust and blood of the Sahel. This is not Europe, where justice is debated in seminar rooms. This is a region where villages are burned in the night, children vanish into armed groups, and entire provinces slip out of government control. In such a landscape, sovereignty is not an abstract principle. It is a matter of life and death. The collapse began more than a decade ago, when NATO's war in Libya cracked open the arsenal of Muammar Gaddafi and flooded the Sahel with weapons. Militants, traffickers, and mercenaries poured south, embedding themselves in Mali's deserts and Niger's borders. What started as local rebellions metastasized into sprawling insurgent movements. Today, the Sahel is considered the world's deadliest conflict zone, with death tolls surpassing those in the Middle East. For the people of these countries, war has become the rhythm of daily life. In central Mali, farmers fear planting crops because insurgents mine their fields. In Burkina Faso, entire towns have been emptied, their residents displaced into makeshift camps. In Niger, border regions have turned into battlefields where state authority evaporates at sunset. Civilians live caught between insurgent brutality and the harsh countermeasures of armies stretched beyond capacity. It was in this crucible that the old governments fell. Elected leaders dependent on foreign troops and donors could not contain the crisis. Soldiers who had lost comrades in ambushes, who saw their families displaced, who fought without equipment, turned their guns not just on insurgents, but on their own governments. The juntas that now rule are not accidents. They are the child of war. And here is where sovereignty becomes non-negotiable. For the junta, every foreign demand, every condition attached to aid, every investigation by external bodies is seen as a direct threat to survival. They are fighting wars not of their own making. They point to Libya's collapse engineered by NATO as the domino that triggered their current nightmare. Western powers set the fire and now want to supervise how Africans put it out. This explains why the ICC, with its talk of investigations into alleged abuses by state forces, became intolerable. In the Sahel, soldiers are not distant figures. They are brothers, cousins, sons of the very communities under attack. To accuse them in The Hague is to criminalize the act of defending one's homeland. The message from Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey is clear. African armies will not be judged by outsiders for fighting wars sparked by outsiders. But sovereignty here is not just defensive, it is transformative. By rejecting institutions like the ICC, the juntas are signaling that they want to remake the rules of engagement entirely. They no longer trust imported models of governance, justice, or security. Instead, they are building alliances that reflect their new priorities. The Alliance of Sahel States AES, formed in 2023, is not just a military pact, it is a declaration that regional self-reliance is the only way forward. French troops have been expelled, Western bases are shrinking, and Russian advisors have been welcomed. The fight for the Sahel is being redefined as an African-led struggle, free from external dictates. And yet, this raises a pressing dilemma. If sovereignty is asserted so fiercely, how will justice for atrocities be delivered? When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger vowed to build indigenous mechanisms for peace and justice, it was not just a rhetorical flourish. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. It was a radical declaration that the foundations of accountability must be dug into African soil, not flown in from Europe. The question that echoes across the Sahel is simple. If not the ICC, then what? The answer, increasingly, is justice shaped by Africans, for Africans. This is not unprecedented. Long before modern states or international tribunals, African societies had intricate systems for resolving disputes, punishing wrongdoing, and restoring social harmony. Justice was never about isolating an offender in a cell thousands of miles away. It was about mending the fabric of a community torn by violence. Take Rwanda's Gacaca courts after the 1994 genocide. Over 1 million cases were heard in community-led settings where perpetrators and survivors confronted each other face to face. It was not perfect, critics noted inconsistencies, but it achieved something The Hague never could: speed, inclusivity, and an attempt at reconciliation. In Ghana, traditional chiefs and councils of elders still mediate land disputes and family conflicts, using methods rooted in dialogue rather than endless litigation. In West African Islamic traditions, Sharia courts have historically provided localized systems of accountability where secular state justice was absent. The Sahel's juntas are tapping into this legacy with a modern twist. They are not proposing to abandon courts or laws, but to weave together customary practices, community authority, and national frameworks into something distinctively African. For instance, truth-telling commissions could document atrocities in local languages, led not by foreign lawyers, but by respected community figures. Hybrid courts might combine professional judges with elders or religious leaders, ensuring verdicts carry both legal and cultural legitimacy. Reparations could take the form not just of monetary compensation, but of rebuilding destroyed villages, restoring farmland, or reintegrating ex-combatants through community service. Such mechanisms would also address a deep frustration: distance. For many Africans, the ICC in The Hague is a faraway abstraction, disconnected from their lived experiences. Victims rarely see proceedings. Communities rarely feel closure. Indigenous systems, by contrast, bring justice to the people. Hearings could take place in town squares, with testimony recorded for history, and with communities witnessing accountability unfold in real time. But the promise of indigenous justice is not just about process. It's about sovereignty. For too long, Africa's narrative of accountability has been written elsewhere. Colonial powers imposed courts that criminalized resistance while excusing their own violence. Post-colonial leaders often leaned on external donors to design reforms. Now, the Sahel is saying, we will not outsource our conscience. Justice will not be dictated by NGOs in New York or judges in The Hague. It will emerge from the soil of Mopti, Tillabéri, and Kaya, places where blood has been spilled and where healing is urgently needed. Still, the challenges are formidable. Yet even with these uncertainties, one thing is clear. The withdrawal from the ICC was not a leap into a void. It was a leap into possibility. By reviving indigenous justice, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are sketching the outline of an alternative model, one that rejects the assumption that Europe is the sole custodian of law and morality. They are reclaiming the right to judge themselves, to confront their own wounds in their own way. And this brings us to the larger battlefield, not the deserts of the Sahel, but the global stage. Because if Africa can prove that it can deliver credible justice on its own terms, it will not just undermine the ICC, it will redefine Africa's place in the international order, which raises the final question. How will this bold defiance reshape Africa's geopolitical standing? And what does it mean for its relationship with the West? The answer stretches far beyond Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. This is not only about the Sahel, it is about the future of Africa's place in the global system. With one declaration, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have transformed themselves from defendants into challengers, forcing the world to confront a question it has long avoided. What happens when Africa no longer plays by rules it did not write? The first tremor is political. For years, international institutions have acted as levers of Western influence. The ICC, the IMF, and the World Bank all carried the same unspoken message. Compliance was rewarded, defiance was punished. By walking away from the ICC, the Sahel trio has shown that these levers no longer guarantee control. If three of the poorest nations in the world can reject The Hague without collapsing, what stops larger powers like South Africa, Nigeria, or Ethiopia from considering the same? The precedent is dangerous for the West. The second tremor is regional. The Alliance of Sahel States AES is no longer just a military pact. It is becoming a symbol of African defiance. Expelling French troops, rejecting donor dependency, and now exiting the ICC, the AES is carving out a blueprint for what sovereignty looks like in practice. Other African blocs are watching. In East Africa, where resentment against the ICC is already strong, leaders may feel emboldened to reassert their own autonomy. In North Africa, where colonial scars run deep, this withdrawal could reignite debates about Europe's lingering grip on African affairs. What began as a Sahelian revolt could cascade into a continental realignment. The third tremor is global. Africa's pivot away from Western institutions is happening alongside a pivot toward alternative partners: Russia, China, Turkey, and even intra-African alliances. The withdrawal from the ICC aligns neatly with this trend. By rejecting a court perceived as European, the Sahel states are positioning themselves within a multipolar order where power is contested, not monopolized. The West fears this because legal legitimacy has always been its last weapon. Military bases may be shut down, corporations may be replaced, but as long as courts in The Hague could summon African leaders, the illusion of control endured. That illusion is now breaking. But this move is not just about defiance, it is also about imagination. If Africa is serious about leaving behind external models, it must build its own. The idea of an African court of sovereign justice is no longer a fantasy. It could emerge under the African Union, with judges drawn from across the continent, combining modern legal standards with African traditions of reconciliation. Such an institution would not only serve Africans, but would also prove to the world that justice does not need to flow from Europe to be legitimate. The West will undoubtedly resist. Expect narratives about impunity, about juntas protecting themselves, about victims left without justice. But those narratives ring hollow when the very same West shields its own leaders from accountability. The hypocrisy is transparent. Washington never signed the Rome Statute. London shrugs off questions about Iraq. Paris evades scrutiny for its Sahel campaigns. Why should Africans accept a system that spares the strong and cages the weak? By leaving the ICC, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have not ended the pursuit of justice. They have reclaimed its ownership. They are asserting that African blood will not be weighed differently from Western blood. They are declaring that the same moral standards must apply to Paris and Washington as they do to Bamako and Ouagadougou. And by doing so, they are reshaping the conversation on sovereignty itself. The stakes are enormous. If Africa succeeds in crafting its own justice mechanisms, it will no longer be the subject of history, but the author. If it fails, the West will point to the collapse as proof that Africans cannot govern themselves without external supervision. But for now, the symbolism is undeniable. Africa has set fire to the old script and dared to write a new one. If the ICC never touched Western leaders, why should Africans still trust it? Do you believe Africa can build its own system of justice stronger than The Hague? Let us know in the comment section. Is this the moment Africa finally breaks free from neo-colonial control? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.